The one thing you shouldn't do is close your mind to the possibility that because you haven't experienced it, it doesn't exist. If these health effects were once suffered by men, dealing with it would have been part of OHS from the get-go, and we wouldn't be having the debate in 2025 trying to persuade ourselves that it's part of OHS when it blindingly obviously is. The creation of standards, it can contribute to legitimising conversation.
Yes.
Breaking down taboos. But most of all, of course, what we want it to do is to provoke action, where organisations actually, take the steps which will enable them ultimately to, retain more female talent, and indeed to female colleagues in their workforce are well supported and engaged and able to perform to their best. The entire ISO process is all about volunteers. You need a diverse population of people involved to get good conversations. If you start with diverse views, it always is a bit challenge then to emerge with consensus. Having a standard could serve to shine a spotlight on something, legitimise conversations, and draw it to the attention of organisational leadership that actually there's a standard on this that kind of suggests definitely give it some attention. Stop talking about compliance and focus on performance, focus on effectiveness. There's that myth that management systems promote culture of compliance. Well, if they do, you're not reading it properly.
Every leader has a story to tell, and the Safe Leader podcast uncovers the diversity story behind leading figures championing change to make our world a better place. Join me, your host, Martin McBride-Wright, as we hear from business leaders, academics, entrepreneurs, and agents of change as they share their journeys of innovation, resilience, and transformation. Together, we explore how they embrace the principles of safe leadership, sharing, acting, feeling, and empowering to create safer, more inclusive environments for everyone. Hello, welcome to the next episode of the Safe Leader podcast. I'm your host, Mark McBride-Wright, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Martin Cottam, who is the chair of the ISO Technical Committee 283, Occupational Health and Safety Management. Martin Cottam has over 40 years' experience in safety management, covering major accident hazards and occupational health and safety, together with experience in engineering asset management, technical governance, and quality management. A former Group Technical Assurance and Quality Director at Lloyd's Register, he has carried out assessments of safety management for organisations across a wide range of sectors in Europe, Asia, and the US. He is a fellow and former chair and former president of the Safety and Reliability Society, and is a chartered engineer and registered European engineer. He's been involved in the development of national and international standards for safety management and asset management for over 25 years, and currently chairs the ISO Technical Committee for Occupational Health and Safety Management. Last year, he was the winner of the Wolf-Barry Medal, a Lifetime Achievement Award from the British Standards Institution, for his contributions to the development of national and international standards. The committee he leads also won ISO's Committee of the Year Award for Leadership and Innovation in 2022. A passionate advocate for effective safety and quality management, Martin continues to influence global standards and mentor the next generation of health and safety professionals. Martin, you are the ideal guest to have on the Safe Leader podcast.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Mark. Thank you very much for the invitation.
So, thank you for accepting it. And what we like doing here on the Safe Leader is getting to understand a bit about the person, the motivations, because there's a lot of stuff out there that we can read about the technical and this and that, but actually it's the people that make up the profession and the people who create the culture. So I want to understand that about yourself. So if we take a time warp, go back in time, take a time capsule, go back to the young Martin, what what inspired you to do what you do today? Talk us through that journey.
Well, it's a good question, Mark, and I think I was one of those people who was a late developer in the sense that I certainly had no idea for a long time through education what it was I wanted to do in career terms. In fact, I think I was in the second year of my physics degree
Okay.
before it dawned on me while I did want to use that technical knowledge, I wasn't really sure what what the opportunities would be for a physicist. Now, at that time, the nuclear industry was quite high profile and quite buoyant, and it was certainly it offered good graduate training programs for both engineers and scientists, and certainly it appealed to me that it would put me on the route to potentially becoming a chartered engineer. So I initially joined National Nuclear Corporation and then subsequently worked for a Swiss engineering consultancy. And in both cases, largely because of the NNC graduate program, the focus was very strongly around safety. And so that was how I sort of came to be in safety. I moved to Lloyd's Register in 1990, hopeful that it would give me the opportunity, which perhaps I was searching for, to diversify that experience outside nuclear. And sure enough, that did happen over time. And I ended up working in oil and gas and transportation and some of the land-based major hazard industries. So and also actually some work in marine, as you might expect with Lloyd's Register. I was
Yes.
involved in one of the first applications of quantified risk assessment in the marine sector.
Oh, that's really interesting. So yeah, I used to do a lot of QRA when I worked in ERM, sort of stepping out into safety management from being at university. But tell us a bit more then about the development of some of the safety tools that you've used, or that QRA project. Can you remember much about it?
Well, it'll be stretching my memory to say much about it, but I think it was part of that journey, if you like, of where the QRA methods, which developed, I guess, primarily in perhaps the military and nuclear industries, were increasingly adopted elsewhere.
Right.
Marine probably being one of the later sectors, sort of major hazard sectors to apply QRA. And even today, I think its application is somewhat limited. But this was in fact application to a large new construction passenger cruise vessel.
Right.
And it was a very interesting thing because a lot of the methods are standard, but actually working out how to apply it to the situation of a ship brought some particular challenges. And yeah, I certainly enjoyed that piece of work, and I think in a way that's characterized my LR career is that I ended up staying 31 years because the
Oh
job
wow.
kept changing.
Wow, I didn't realize it
And
was
new
that lengthy.
challenges, kept arising. And in the same way, I ended up spending a secondment about which I had little choice, frankly, in LRQA, the management system certification
Yeah.
arm of LR, because they were looking to develop safety. Well, the clients were demanding some form of OHS management system
Yeah.
assessment
Yeah.
because those certifications were already well established for quality and environment, but there
Yes.
seemed to be a gap for OHS. And of course, there wasn't an international standard, and so certifiers were scrabbling around trying to work out how they could provide some form of assessment. LRQA was not a first mover in that
Right.
space, and then began to see the evidence that it needed to do something. So I got seconded. I'm sometimes tempted to say against my will, to on a 6-month secondment to LRQA, which ultimately lasted 3 years, to
Right.
set up the OHS certification, which of course now is standard fare for a
Yeah.
certifier. But in those days it wasn't, and so we had to develop an interpretation of BS 8800, the
Mhm.
only available guidance standard. And I
Right.
then led the assessments around the world to sort of establish that capability in Asia and in Europe and in the States.
So what's the
across
pro?
a lot of sectors, which, was eye-opening. I'd never in my life expected to be assessing OHS in a pet food factory or a tire manufacturing factory or a paper mill in Poland, but I did all those things.
There's a few things going through my mind. I guess with the QRA element, I always remember when we did QRA, you were relying upon established data sets to then
Yeah.
quantify your risk probability and etc. But then if it's never been done before, then it's a whole chicken and egg situation. How do you develop those initial data sets that you then subsequently use? And are those initial data sets even representative to be a good first pass? Um, that's just more of a comment on my mind, really. And then, how creating a creating a standard that's a it sounds like a it's the sort of thing that ultimately a company is going to be assessed on and accredited against. But to then be involved in the development in the first instance, it must be a very collaborative process with goodwill, good intentions from everyone to see the benefit in getting involved.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the entire ISO process is all about volunteers.
Yeah,
No money changes hands
yeah,
at all. People do it, either with an employer's blessing in the spare hours of the day, or more typically, in their own free time.
okay.
But yeah, consensus is the basis on which decisions are made, and so you need a a diverse population of people involved to get good conversations. If you start with diverse views, it always is a bit challenge then to emerge with consensus. And then the consultation process is, of course, the key really to the success of ISO standards, which is that, it's not just the 30, 40, 60 people in the working group who actually do the drafting, who make the decisions. The standards then passed out to national standards bodies. There can
Yes.
be public consultation. National standards bodies maintain mirror committees as well, which monitor and shadow the work of a committee like mine. And
Right.
so effectively there's a network of, I was thinking the other day, it's well over 1,000 people I would expect on one of our standards who
Wow.
routinely, the expectation is you'll get the document, we would expect to have comments back. But then, of course, the public comment process can amplify that significantly.
So talk us through the ISO 45000 series that you've been working on most recently, I believe.
Yeah, sure. So ISO 45001 itself was published in 2018 by
Hmm.
a project committee which ISO set up explicitly for that purpose, and that you could say was ISO's first foray into developing um, standards in the field of OHS.
Hmm.
And the nature of project committees is when the job's done, they're shut down. So when that happened, ISO established a permanent technical committee, TC283, and so I became the first chair of
Right.
that committee. So 45001 was already there, if you will.
Hmm.
From that point on, we've published a number of things. First off, a handbook aimed at smaller organisations explaining the implementation of 45001 in a language and in a style that's more appropriate to small organizations, because they have their own challenges.
Hmm.
The first standard that we developed was 45003 on psychological health, safety and well-being, which is probably the best known of our guidance standards, and that was
Okay.
published in 2021, which was great timing in a way, more by
Yeah.
accident than design, because at that point, I think the factors like the global pandemic had
Yeah.
really opened people's eyes and broken down some of the taboos around that whole area. So that
Yeah.
was fortunate. We also, in the pandemic, as a sort of fast track project, produced ISO Pass 45005, which was guidelines on the management of the risks of COVID-19 in the workplace, which we've subsequently extended on to produce 45006, which is a general guidance standard on the management of infectious diseases in the workplace.
Okay.
And the one I've missed out, if you've been tracking the numbers, is 45,004,
Or
and that's a guidance standard on OHS performance evaluation. And then we've recently kicked off a whole suite of further work, which will extend long beyond my period as chair of TC283. The revision of ISO 45001 is the big ticket item,
yeah,
but then new guidance standards as well. ISO PAS 45007 on the OHS impacts of climate change,
okay,
45,008 on OHS aspects of remote working, and that's all types of remote working, not sort of just working from home or in a coffee shop.
yeah.
45,010 on menstruation, menstrual health, and menopause in the workplace, which is a really one I place great store
Yes,
by. I think very, very important for us. And we're just doing preliminary work before formally starting the clock on 45,009, which will be a guidance standard on OHS leadership and governance.
oh right, interesting. So yes, I wanted to pick up on the 45,010. I've seen LinkedIn activity on that and at Eco Engineers we have a menopause network as well. So it's a very growing area where there's much need and much focus needed. I was so yeah. How is that progressing then? That is it quite early days, or is it quite?
It should be published within, I think, about 12 months.
Mhm.
And that sounds like it's a long way off, but actually in ISO terms, when most standards development is a 3-year track,
Okay.
getting into the final year feels like the last few yards. And also that last period, I'll put it the other way around. The front end is where all the difficult work is done, I would argue, which is you
Okay.
start from, not quite a blank sheet of paper, but you bring a group together, and that, we're taking as a starting point, in fact, a British a BS standard that was published in 2023. But then you bring an international group together to say, well, let's develop this on to be an ISO standard.
Okay.
And of course, potentially you're opening Pandora's box at that point as to where
Yeah.
the conversation could go and how the document might evolve. But the last 12 months or so is very much that final consultation and voting phase, which I described. And so there'll be kind of 3 months devoted to a ballot, which will include public consultation. And then obviously the committee may well be faced with, 500, 800 comments
Yes.
to methodically process and consider and tweak the document. So it's all about sort of refinement at the final stages, and the sort of the more creative part of the work goes on at the front end.
And what does the 45,010 hope to achieve for women in the workplace, or people who menstruate? What does it hope to seek out to achieve for them?
I think on the one hand, the sort of easy answer is it provides guidance on what organisations can and should do.
Mm-hmm.
To support women in the workplace through with those issues.
Yeah.
I think the other way I'd answer it though, Mark, is that I think the creation of standards, why would you choose to have a standard? I think it does a number of things. It, in some ways, the fact of standards brought into being often can contribute to legitimizing conversation.
Yes.
Breaking down taboos. I think it can serve also to put onto the radar of senior leadership in organizations the fact that this is a topic, that's current and that they need to be considering.
Yes.
So I think it does quite a lot to legitimize discussion and also hopefully to provoke discussion. But most of all, of course, what we want it to do is to provoke action, where
Yes.
organizations actually, take the steps which will enable them ultimately to, retain more female talent, and
Yes.
indeed to, make sure that they've got that the female colleagues in their workforce are well supported and engaged and able to perform to their best.
And also to help men talk about it, because it can often feel like a conversation because it doesn't link to directly to what you do or go through,
Absolutely.
it's like you don't have a say, or have the right to have an opinion, or a viewpoint, or to take, even just take part in the discussion. But actually, in the movement that I've seen so far, we absolutely need men to be part of it, because men need to be part of the whole gender equality movement. And you can tell when someone's nervous about talking about a topic that they don't have any personal relationship to directly themselves. Their voice goes shallow. They feel like they're walking on eggshells. And I think, personally, I think that's probably a reason why we've had a lot of inaction over a long period of time, because we just haven't been having the conversation about the barriers that women have faced as they've got further through their career. And or it's been trivialized, their symptoms, what they've gone through at this stage of their life, or at whatever stage, because menopause can happen at many different ages. It's not restricted to a later life thing.
Well,
These
I
are things that
completely. Yeah,
these are
sorry.
things that I'm learning as our menopause network grows. We've got a fabulous co-chair in the network who's very open about making the decision to have a hysterectomy early on in her life, in her 20s, and so she had induced menopause at a very young age, and she speaks openly about how that's affected her. And but by having role models that can then speak openly about this, but then also be supported culturally within the workplace, with having very formalized things like standards mirror the conversation that they're then opening about. It must be a really great conduit for culture change.
Yeah, and I completely subscribe to your point about needing men in the workplace to advocate for this standard. In fact, it's
Yes.
one of the key messages I'm delivering to our whole TC at its upcoming plenary meeting. And it's why I've been particularly keen to make sure that we were actively promoting the standard in the period while I, as a man, am still the chair of the committee, because I'm handing over to a woman.
Okay.
And there could be that perception, if people start to hear about the standard later, oh well, that's why TC 283 is developing this. It's a
Interesting.
committee that we know with a woman leader. Well, that's not the case at all. It started under my leadership. We're irrevocably committed to it under my leadership. And
Brilliant.
it's been really interesting, I think, to see the journey that some of the men who have participated in the working group have
Yes.
gone on. And I think that's, you say people, maybe don't have life experience, and therefore are limited and feel trepidation.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing about that is to accept that that's life,
Yes.
and that it
Totally.
shouldn't be a barrier. Just be curious, just be supportive, and learn as you go. Um, the one thing you shouldn't do is close your mind to the possibility that because you haven't experienced it, it doesn't exist. But I do feel so strongly about this issue of gender, the historic gender imbalance in OHS. I still find it astonishing that here we are in the 21st century, finally working out that it might be a good idea to have PPE that's designed around the female
Yeah.
physique, and as opposed to, I can't get my head around how we have for so long apparently tolerated the idea that, well, it doesn't fit women and therefore it doesn't give them the protection that it would give to a man who's of the right size that
Yeah.
it was designed for, but somehow that's okay.
It's got through. How?
And interestingly, we've had some pushback on this 45,010 standard. It's quite unusual in
Yes.
283 when we go out for, comment from national standards bodies. For anybody, I mean, they may have strong views about what should be in the standard, and
Yeah.
frequently do, but it's relatively rare that anybody writes back as a comment and says, well, this standard shouldn't be being written, you
Yeah.
shouldn't do it. Or it's fine if ISO wants to do this, but it's got nothing to do with OHS, so don't put it in the 45,000 series.
Yeah.
Um,
Interesting.
I just find it astonishing. I think if these health effects were ones suffered by men,
Yeah.
they would have been part of dealing with it would have been part of OHS from the get-go, and we
Yeah.
wouldn't be having the debate here we are in 2025 trying to persuade ourselves that it's part of OHS when it blindingly obviously is, as far
Where
as
are
I can
you?
see.
Where are you seeing? So, firstly, given the work that I do in diversity, equity, and inclusion, that doesn't surprise me that there are some pockets or regions or entities that have a viewpoint that what you're doing shouldn't even be relevant. And it's good on you in the committee for, making it so that you're still pushing through despite those sort of headwinds. And that's actually a litmus test for progress, such that over time, if you start bringing in more standards that link to things that are culturally coming up and part of the common discourse in society nowadays, seeing a lessening of resistance is a good benchmark. And
Yeah, and I think standards have can play an important part and it's important standards lead, and they're not a rear view mirror on OHS, as it was practiced previously. This consensus process can be, you can fear that it will produce, if you like, a sort of lowest common denominator
right,
solution, because are all the more radical and interesting ideas going to get watered down or squeezed out. I find it very reassuring to see, there may be a few lone voices of the type I mentioned, but there's also an awful lot, huge majority
big
of people
commitment.
involved in our committee who are fully behind this and know that it's actually there to help to challenge and to push the barriers forward.
So we're recording this in March 2025. So just to give a bit of a timestamp there, and you mentioned about the slow progress, glacial progress on women's PPE, and even the fact that it's taken so long to be part of the dialogue, and it's only of recent that it's starting to filter through. And I know some amazing campaigners that work in this area. Bold as Brass is a great organisation in the UK that push for this. I have to ask the question though around the recent change in leadership in the United States and the erasure, like the blatant erasure online of programs that talk about women's PPE and things like that. Do you see this having a longer term effect or like halting the progress that's being made?
I suppose at one level, you can't but feel it's not helpful. But in another sense, I also question, certainly from the standardization point of view, which is, I think, the area we're talking about, I don't think it'll make much difference, to be very
Right.
honest. Interestingly, the US, is just one country in ISO terms.
Yeah.
One vote. We have 100 countries involved in the
Okay.
committee. And besides, and of course, the other thing to say is, the political agenda in a given country doesn't necessarily flow through directly into the views which the national standards body would choose to contribute to, or individuals from that country would contribute
Yeah.
into work such as ours. So in that sense, I don't have any concerns specific to our ability to do what we want to do, except for the fact that, of course, it may affect the impact and the way those documents are received in certain countries.
Yes.
And that's obviously, that bit is a concern,
I
because
guess
I'd
it's
like our standards to be embraced,
I
as
guess it's
widely
about
as possible.
the availability of data. We agree, yes, it's a good thing, and now there's a standard for it. And where there then would have been reference data or places that one could go to, and one of the world's largest economies and industrial players, it's then absent. The only reason I asked the question is because I was on a recent EHS, like a new think tank that's been set up by John Donny from
Yes,
the
the What Works
the What Works
Institute
Institute.
for
Yeah.
EHS. Yes,
Yes.
something very dear to my heart, actually.
Yes. So yeah, I met Johnny at an event last year, 2 years ago, and we've kept in touch. I'm going to see him shortly, actually. But that caught my ear. If you were on that same webinar, then it was part of the conversation talking about the erasure of all those data and OSHA it being out of scope eventually, and it feels to me like it. Where do we save this data, for so it's still accessible, even though it may not be
Mhm.
on the primary domain where it would have readily been held?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, to note that, the what Works Institute in the US is part of, I think, a pattern of emerging interest in evidence.
Yes.
Um, the Lloyd's Register Foundation's establishing a global evidence centre for safety with a very similar sort of ambition to put more of a spotlight onto the question of, what is the evidence for particular OHS interventions and their success. And I think that, that's a very positive trend for
Hmm.
the OHS profession or community, shall we say. Not least because, of course, it creates a demand for data.
Yes.
And so maybe that is in some ways a counterbalance, which is, well, okay, there may be some parties who are not particularly keen for this data or don't see the need for it to exist.
Hmm.
But there's clearly a pull for evidence and data from other sources, and so maybe that will fill the gap.
Mm. Where else? So I interfaced a bit with Lloyd's Register when I was part of the Royal Academy of Engineering. I took part in some focus groups with the safer complex systems. Were you part of that work at all, or?
No, I've had some involvement with the world, well, at least commenting on the World Risk Poll, which I think is one of
Right.
the foundation's, most important contributions. Certainly from a TC283 perspective, we found it hugely informative that such an enormous global survey is pulling up some really interesting results. I mean, last year's results in particular highlighted what a small proportion. In fact, I think it was hovering around 50%, but actually possibly just slightly under,
Right.
of the of the world's population have had OHS training,
Right.
full stop, ever, at any
Ever.
time.
Yeah.
And that was a bit of a wake up call, I think, in my mind, thinking, you know, are we in effectively advocating for complete management systems? Are we actually being, too ambitious when in some ways there's a whole swathe of the world's
Mm.
workforce where if we put our advocacy purely around just do some safety training,
Basic training, slip,
actually we
trips, and
might,
falls.
that and
Yeah.
that's influencing our thinking quite a lot now about what is the offering that we should have for smaller enterprises in particular.
And
Um,
do you get to help? So for where those are not where those where people maybe aren't well, not maybe, where they're not receiving training, would it be a case of helping support those SMEs within certain communities, certain countries to help roll something out? Like maybe it's because it's not a legal requirement from the national executive. Maybe there's no health and
yeah,
safety executive equivalent in that geography, and so it just, you
yeah,
know,
I think our the levers available to us as a standards committee or to ISO as a standards writing organisation are quite limited.
yes,
It's all about trying to influence.
yes,
So, I think the best hope in my view would be if we could produce documents which are well received and which lay out both, the importance of, but a sensible, pragmatic, maybe stepwise approach
mhm,
to it. The hope is that encourages both governments and individual organizations, at an individual level to take some action. And then, I'm sure others will, other agencies or indeed consultancies can potentially provide the support then on the ground to kind of
yes.
make that happen. I think we're more trying to kind of influence at the hearts and minds piece and give somebody a sort of a milestone to try and achieve.
Where so you mentioned was it 45,008 or 7? I forget the list.
So
One of
so do I, Mark.
one of them was on like leadership,
Nine,
and
nine, 45,009.
so
Yeah,
that squares right into the themes in my book, The Safe Leader. So my work's all about trying to leverage the familiarity that engineers have with physical safety and extend that into psychological safety. And ultimately, what we do then is speak to our shared common humanity, ultimately,
Yeah.
because in research that we've done at Equal Engineers, we found in our masculinity and engineering research, we found quite a high incident rate of suicidal ideation and self harm within the respondents, and also people experiencing work colleagues who've lost their life due to suicide. It mirrored the Office of National Statistics data sets, which have come out, the years that we've done it. So this has now become a sort of longitudinal study for us as an organisation. But when I uncovered the first set of data, it really was a light bulb aha moment for me, with my two hats on, being a safety engineer, thinking about risk and managing out hazards, designing out hazards and managing residual risk to as low as reasonably practicable, and culturally organizations like understanding that wholeheartedly. It was never even questioned. And then putting my diversity and inclusion practitioner hat on, trying to make advocacy for the needs to bring your whole self to work and be your true authentic self. When I saw this data coming through, I was like, well, hang on, if we were getting inclusion and belonging right, then everyone would be able to be open about whatever root causes that might be driving this high incident rate of suicidal ideation and self-harm, which disproportionately is affecting the men in the engineering industry. So maybe this is a way in which to frame DEI as being linked then to physical safety and psychological safety. And this is the way we nucleate the conversation in a non-threatening, non-polarizing way, which counteracts the way it is we've typically had the conversation up until now. When we focus on each demographic identity, it takes the conversation to a very shallow them and us, what about me ism type mindset. And so I wonder then, in your leadership ISO standard that you're developing, like what how does it layer in the blend between like personal identity and personal values and bringing your whole self to work, and then linked to just good technical leadership, and being a good mentor and stuff like that?
Well, several things you prompt me to say there, and I'll try and not forget the second while I tell you about the first. Just to mention, because it will be of interest to you, you're perhaps aware of it, but certainly to listeners, that there is a current initiative at BSI to produce a guidance standard on suicide prevention.
Ah,
And I was
yes.
directly involved in the early discussions. In fact, I facilitated the meetings that developed the scope for that document. And again, I think that's, that points to the same thing about where having a standard could, serve to shine a spotlight on something, legitimize conversations, and draw it to the attention of organizational leadership that actually, there's a standard on this that kind of suggests you might want to
Definitely.
give it some attention. So I think that's the first thing perhaps to say. The second, I think the broader question was how do standards address this issue? We've learned as we were going, I think, with the 45,000 series. In 45,001, I think it would be fair to say it's pretty weak on the issue of the organisation needing to consider and address the full diversity of its workforce and the associated needs for that. There was some interesting ISO research which kind of was a bit of a wake-up call for us, because when you're trying to craft a standard to be sort of as economical as possible and succinct and so
Yes.
on, whenever you get laundry lists of examples, they get challenged as to, do you need all these examples and why do they occur in 16 different places, and it's not quite the same list. And so that tends to produce a pressure to sort of simplify down, and so we ended up with phrases like considering the needs of all the workforce, or all workers, I think was the phrase. The ISO research, which was done specifically on our standard and on some other standards, told us that actually that's a fatally compromised approach,
Okay.
because the people who already fully understand what diversity is about, we know what the different attributes would be that you would need to consider and so on, and know that you'd include older people, younger people,
Yeah.
people with disabilities, neurodiverse. On you go. The people who know that, they know it anyway. So that you achieve nothing because
Yeah.
they're
Doesn't
going to
need
deal with
spelled
it.
out. Yeah.
And the people that you're trying to influence who don't get it, that kind of wording just goes straight over their heads because you haven't put in all the examples,
Yeah.
which would trigger them to think, oh, I didn't realize it should be include this and that. So we've moved now to the last standard we published had a dedicated section specifically on the need for the organisation to consider the
Okay.
diversity of its workforce, and the implication is, well, that section sits right at the top of the standard, alongside two other sections in the the context section.
Yeah.
Effectively, the message is in that section is the organisation needs to understand its internal and external environment in which it's operating,
Yes.
and the needs and expectations of stakeholders. And the punchline really is all of that needs to then be taken into account in designing the management system.
Right.
That's the driver of exactly how you then implement all the elements of the management system, is you have to take that stuff into account. Well, we've now added the a third thing to consider as a driver, and that's the diversity of the workforce. And we did that in ISO 45006, and I'm expecting us to take the same approach in the revision of 45001.
Interesting.
So that will then become, if you like, a requirement that it is a driver of the way the organisation then goes about developing and implementing the management system.
Yeah. No,
So
that's great.
I'm hopeful that will be more effective in a sense at delivering a stronger message. I mean, obviously we're revising the standard after five or more years in use, or considerably more than five, and in some cases, revision is about rewording things which weren't well expressed before or
Okay.
didn't get understood. But it's also, I think, about trying to make sure that you're pushing the frontiers forward and raising the challenge for organisations in a sensible way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it'll have um a feed forward influence on a sort of medium term time scale
Yeah,
as it gradually filters through to certification requirements. You know, you need to be ISO 45001 accredited in order to be on this framework.
exactly.
Your next accreditation review is coming up in 3 years' time. Then that has these
Yeah,
elements
you
in
have
it.
to be addressing it.
Yeah, and then you see these elements in it, and for the organizations that haven't been on it, they're like, oh my goodness, we need to do something about this. How do we do it? Right now, let's go out to market to try and find some consultancies or whoever that can support us. And then you have that's then the framework to do it, but then you've got the whole internal cultural need that to go through as well.
Yeah, and I think I'm very content with the way the team has come up with this solution of how to
Yeah,
place it in the standard, because I think it then becomes very, I think we're sending a very clear message, which is that you're considering the diversity of the workforce for a very specific purpose, which is to make sure that the management system supports them and their safety, health, and
yeah,
well-being. In other words, it's all about safety. It's not a piece of kind of fashionable wokery that it just is a
yeah,
good idea to be. Why shouldn't we? Everybody else talks about DEI. We should be talking. It's not that at
yeah.
all. It's actually about safer outcomes, healthier outcomes, and better
It
well-being for people.
it
Which is
makes me
which is why you have an OHS management system, isn't it? So if you're
well.
not doing that, why bother having a management system
Well,
if
it
you're going to
also
exclude people?
it also makes me think about I've been part of a group right now where we've been looking at how safety is understood as today's engineering students. And of course, today's engineering students are tomorrow's engineering leaders. And what my chemical engineering bias I've found is that I perceive that everyone understands safety as process safety, about fire mitigation and blasts and all that, but actually safety means something different to an electrical engineering student compared to a civil engineering student, to a chemical, to mechanical, etc. And so even when we were looking at process safety courses, the relative proportionality on what's focused on management systems and process safety management versus the more technical side of things, like actual process safety calculations and that, there was less of a understanding in process safety management. I think it was a longitudinal study that Imperial College did, it's where I went, to quantify the impact, to look at the impact for alumni that had gone off into industry. Did what we taught you on process safety actually help you now that you're in technical roles? And there was some feedback on how to sort of change the relative proportionality. And one of the feedback points, I think, was about the need to, it would have been useful to have understood more about what active process safety management was. And I remember being that student, well, being a graduate, going into industry to be a technical safety engineer and then starting to understand about the HSE and the goal setting regime versus OSHA and more, tick box or checklist type regimes in the US, and how that I didn't even understand what ISO standards were, to be honest, when I was a student, or how they're used and applied. So if you're bringing all these things in now, if we then couple that with more active education on what process safety management systems are, and also do a little bit of education on bringing closer together workplace safety and technical safety, process safety, so the Venn diagram of overlap is a bit tighter, and the fact that it includes culture and psychological safety and the culture of the team that you're in and who's represented on the team that you're doing the engineering with, I think it'll go a long way to really embedding DEI just as part of how we do our work. So no, I think it's great. It's good that the team are that you've done that.
Yeah, and I think there are some universities. Well, I know of one or two specifically who are teaching about management systems,
Yeah.
about standards, and about management systems. And certainly, I mean, I share your feeling in a way. I mean, I think it would have been a very useful part of my education to have had something that was more about, if you like, the management processes that sit around, if you like, the technical safety elements, because it took me quite a while, I think, in my career to really kind of get under the skin of what a management system really can be.
Yes.
I think too many organizations still don't actually see it as a system. It's just a set of processes, and it's taken me
Yes.
a while to understand actually it's called a system for a very particular reason. It's about information flows between processes and interactions between processes. And I think I've come to see management systems over the years, I think increasingly because of my risk management background, all the elements of a management system to me are the control measures.
Yes.
The management system is effectively the Swiss cheese model
Yes.
exemplified,
Yes.
and it's affected the way I've sort of looked at things like technical governance in my role at Lloyd's Register. Was actually thinking, this is a whole series of controls around particular risks. In this case, the risk of releasing work containing technical errors to a
Mhm.
client, and applying that sort of risk lens to it, of thinking, well, the risk is higher with some services than others, and therefore the controls need to be stronger in some
Yeah.
areas than others. And you've got front end controls and you've got back end controls. What's the right blend under different circumstances? But we tend to compartmentalize these things, don't we, as slightly
Yes.
different. There's risk management over here, and technical safety sitting somewhere else, and a
Yeah.
management system's another thing, when actually they're all, as you say, it's a Venn diagram.
Part of the same thing. Right. Okay. Quick fire questions. So,
Okay.
what is the one book or resource that has deeply influenced your career?
Investigation reports, definitely. I find them so compelling to see what really happened. I think it brings you back to reality sometimes, doesn't it, to sort of
Mhm.
understand actually an organization had all this in place, but actually this is what happened on the day.
Mm. Coffee or tea?
Always decaf coffee, black.
If you could implement one global safety rule, what would it be?
I'm tempted to say stop talking about compliance and focus on performance, focus on effectiveness. There's that myth that management systems promote people say they promote a culture of compliance. Well, if they do, you're not reading it properly. It doesn't talk about compliance, it talks about making your processes effective.
What's a project you're most proud of?
I think, well, I guess it would almost have to be, and especially in the sort of twilight weeks of my time chairing TC283, it's been such a pleasure and privilege to see that committee grow from where we started to where it is, and there's a lot more still to do. There's no room for complacency, but I think particularly winning the Lawrence D. Eicher Award, the Committee of the Year, on the committee's 4th birthday.
Brilliant.
Was quite an achievement, because we're so often compared with much better established committees, that have been around 20 or 30 years for quality, for environment.
Right.
And it's a hard comparison when you're the new kid on the block. So I took some comfort from that award.
Brilliant. Are you a morning or evening person?
Definitely morning.
One word to describe your leadership style.
When I left LR, I remember a speech made by one of my team members who said that I gave them a lot of space and trust, but was very firm if they got off the track that I believed we'd agreed.
Okay.
So I guess it's a bit of a blend.
What's the biggest misconception about occupational health and safety?
I think that it's got to be that it's a cost to business, isn't it?
And what's one piece of advice you'd give for aspiring leaders?
That's tricky. I think from my own experience, be open to opportunities that seem a bit, left field. Because as I've assembled knowledge from a rather, meandering path, but actually I bring it all together, and I find it's now quite useful. But I think in terms of the other thing, quickly, if I may, Mark, would be, I think from the thing I'd say for most young, engineering safety professionals is focus on or develop your communication and influencing skills. I think that's really something to work on from the get-go. And
yes,
it can be it can be game changing.
Yeah, that is really good advice. Certainly, I've found bringing, I've done some investment in public speaking, and I've done some investment in myself in being an entrepreneur and growing a business. That there is real strength in being able to land your point, communicate with different stakeholders, and push yourself out of your comfort zone, so on and so forth. So, thank you so much, Martin.
It's been a real pleasure.
Really enjoyed the chat. If people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
I'm on LinkedIn, so you'll certainly find me there. And I'm happy for you to put my email address in the show notes if you'd care to, Mark.
Absolutely, we will do that. Well, thank you so much, Martin. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Again, really enjoyed it, Mark.
You have been listening to the Safe Leader podcast, uncovering the diversity story behind leading figures championing change to make our world a better place. If you have enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to the Safe Leader podcast on your podcast platform of choice and get notified when a new episode goes live. Did you know that we also offer a full transcript on each of our podcast episodes? Check out my website, martinmcbride.com. Here, you can also explore the training, coaching, and keynote speaking services I offer. And whilst you're there, why not join the Safe Leader community by subscribing to the Safe Leader Insights mailing list? Thank you for listening, and please come back and join us on a future episode.